Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Kep, co-founder of From Day One, our forum on corporate values, and we're looking forward to today's webinar on the power of inclusion and social impact. Before we get started, I want to share something special we have for today's attendees. One of our monthly virtual conferences is coming up next Wednesday, November 17th, and it's titled Building a Skilled Team: How Upskilling, Coaching, and Recognition Can Help. It's going to be particularly valuable for employers who are looking for creative ways to attract top talent and keep them engaged in this time of historic labor shortages. Thanks to our partners, including today's sponsor, we have some complimentary VIP tickets available for those who've joined today's webinar. That's you. I've put a link in the chat space right now. Please check this one out. The regular price for our conference tickets is $149, and this link will give you a free VIP ticket for the whole day's activities. Today, we'll be exploring the topic, Inclusion and Intersectionality are CSR's biggest opportunity. Here's the gist of it. You cannot be part of community solutions without community. We often think of diversity, equity, and inclusion as internal affairs and corporate social responsibility as external affairs. But just as people have intersectionality, so too do corporate culture, philanthropy, governance, and social impact. CSR cannot be effective without community leadership and inclusion. And the time's come for companies to take a closer look at the relationship between their DEI goals and their corporate social impact to gain a deeper understanding of how intersectionality applies to lasting community impact. Our sponsor today is Salesforce.org. I'll tell you a bit about them. Salesforce.org is the social impact center of Salesforce. They build powerful technology for and with our community of nonprofit, educational, and philanthropic organizations to help them operate effectively, to raise funds, and to connect. Salesforce.org Philanthropy Cloud is a platform that connects employees to the causes they care about through giving, matching, and volunteering. You can learn more about Philanthropy Cloud at salesforce.org. Now, a few quick logistical items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand soon after the event, so you can look out for an email in about 24 hours with the link. That email will also have info on how you can get professional development credits for this session from the Society of Human Resource Management and the HR Certification Institute. And look out for a written account of the conversation soon on our website at fromday1.co. Finally, about 45 minutes into the webinar, we'll have a Q&A session. You can submit your questions anytime using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now I'd like to introduce our MC for today, a maestro of moderating, Lydia Dishman. Lydia is a staff editor for Fast Company, who's an expert on topics including leadership, technology, and the workplace. Lydia has also written for CBS Money Watch, Fortune, Popular Science, and the New York Times, among others. Okay, Lydia, over to you to hear about our speakers.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We have an excellent discussion teed up for you. I did want to start by saying that I've been thinking about this issue. I'd wager that in the before times, and you know what that is, BC, before COVID, a large number of people never gave much thought to CSR and DEI unless they were professionally connected to those efforts. Then the pandemic happened. Then the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others happened too. Piled on top of that were natural disasters, political division, and a rising tide of violence against Asian Americans. People were forced to think more intentionally about the future, and that included what they expected of their employers. A recent statistic actually revealed that an overwhelming majority, 93% of employees, believe that companies must lead with purpose, and that purpose must be intersectional. As companies made pledges and pronouncements to stand for equity and racial justice, many also committed to the communities that they served, in part by reducing their impact on the planet and in many other ways as well. So after 19 months of essentially crisis management, leaders are beginning to see a way forward, and that would connect the dots more clearly. So here to discuss the progress and the challenges are my insightful group of professionals with their fingers on the pulse. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and briefly give us some context as to how the relationship between your organization's DEI efforts and goals and CSR have changed since last March. if you can remember back that far. Debbie, let's start with you.
Thank you, Lydia. What a great opening. I want to thank everyone for coming today and for being a part of this and for joining the Salesforce.org conversation. I think it's really interesting that this group is together today talking about this issue because the word of the day is actually intentional. And this is very intentional, this group. We've come together because we've recognized this change that we're seeing in the space of corporate responsibility and social impact. I lead the social impact marketing and insights team at Salesforce.org. So I have this great opportunity and responsibility to tell stories every day of communities that are doing good. They're changing the world. They're at the front lines of change. Those are educational communities. Those are nonprofit communities. And through that lens, really find ourselves asking the question, do the stories we tell represent the voices of the communities that we're trying to represent and we're trying to impact? And that is kind of at the crux of how I came about this particular intersection. And when I look at the journey that Salesforce as a company has had, we really found ourselves in a position where we knew that all of the work that's being done in product, in philanthropy, and in technology always had an equality lens. But then we started looking at terms like equity and terms like inclusion in a very different way, spurred by the multi-crisis environment we were in the last 18 months. So if we start looking at terms like equity, what we realize is that problem solving doesn't just belong to philanthropy or philanthropists. It belongs to everybody. And if that's true, and this is a truly equitable world where we all have the power to make change, then how do we provide that agency to communities and to everyone that we're engaging with to make that change? And that's where I think the notion of employee voices and community voices comes into the corporate responsibility dialogue in a way that it never has before. It's really this game-changing moment, and I'm really excited for it.
Definitely a game-changing moment. And I said, never let a good crisis go to waste. We have a lot of opportunity here. Kavita.
Thanks, Lydia, and thanks, Debbie and Salesforce for having me. So I'm Kavita Sood-Isaacs. I'm a senior manager on the global community relations team at Baxter International. And as a part of our work, we help manage our social impact investments through the Baxter International Foundation, as well as Baxter's product donations and corporate responsibility portfolio. And really what's changed over the last 18 months is that collaboration, both not only with our external stakeholders, but internal employee engagement and business resource groups, or BRGs as we call them. I serve as liaison with our BRGs, which are managed out of HR. Whereas previously we were two separate functions. Now we are working closely to look at, as Debbie just said, this is not just a problem of philanthropy, but how can we look across the board to see what our stakeholders need? And, we launched Activating Change Today, or ACT, which is a I&D priority across Baxter with 4-pronged lens from the workplace, workforce, marketplace, and communities. And I'm sure I'll have a chance to dive into those, but really taking a look at what are all the aspects and all of the audiences that we need to meet and be held accountable to. So I look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we have these ever-widening concentric circles, don't we? Especially as we're working in this particular topic. Jen, how about you go next?
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity. It's so wonderful to be here together with my esteemed colleagues and to talk about a very important topic. So I'm Jen Kim Field. I head up our corporate social responsibility and our corporate foundation here at Schein. And who are we? We're a Fortune 500 company with 21,000 employees in 32 countries. And we're a healthcare solutions company, but you may not know us unless you're a dentist or a doctor because we're B2B. And so I challenge you the next time you're in one of your doctor's offices or dentist's office, if they're pulling out their gloves or their tongue depressor, it's going to have a little box and it might have Schein on the corner of it. Because that's how I knew once my son went to his pediatrician. But I'm going to echo really what Debbie and Kavita said around intersectionality and also collaboration, because I think that's the trend that you're seeing. And that's why we're here today to talk about how DEI and CSR are being coordinated. The one thing that I'll add to that is, doing well by doing good, and this notion of enlightened self-interest has really been at the core of who we stand for. We were actually started by Henry and Esther Schein nearly 90 years ago in a pharmacy in Queens here in New York. And so they were always big into community, taking care of employees and working with all of our different stakeholders. And so that is at the core of who we are as a purpose-driven company. And I'd say that particularly on the D&I, so that corporate social responsibility has been formally with us for over 2 to 3 decades. On the D&I side, we formally started a D&I council in 2020 because of everything that you just mentioned, Lydia. Mm-hmm. And the 4 tenets is a holistic approach of D&I for that council, and it's talent, culture, marketplace, and society. And I think in that society bucket is where you're seeing us connect more and making sure that we are ensuring that employees are being heard and how they want to support the communities based on what the employee resource groups want to do is where we are. And that same as Kavita, it was traditionally in HR, but we sit out of corporate affairs. And now the D&I function is a shared responsibility between HR and corporate affairs. So you're seeing that connectivity, and I envision we will see it more in the future too. So thank you.
Concentric circles and ecosystems, really. It seems like, you could almost see the word cloud developing as you all are explaining these changes. Kimberly, how about you?
Thank you for having us. Thanks to Salesforce and of course you, Lydia, for moderating today. I'm Kim Sundi and I am from Kellogg Company. I am our Senior Director of Sustainability and Social Impact. And so my role really, as everyone on this panel will tell you, we can't do great work alone. So I lead our stakeholder engagement, and really my responsibility is to amplify the power of partnership and then make sure that Kellogg Company's goal of giving better days to 3 billion people by 2030 is really amplified and resonates with our employees, with stakeholders, investors. And so when I think about how our work has changed since last March, I loved your stat, Lydia, because I think it really crystallizes what's important to Kellogg, which is our people. We always say our people are our greatest asset. And so early in the pandemic, we had just relaunched our vision and our purpose, which is making sure that everyone has a seat at the table. And that's internally and externally, of course. But then externally, our business employee resource groups have continued to play a much more prominent role in things that are consumer facing. So things like cereals that have been released, Pop-Tarts for Dia de los Muertos, and really unlocking the power of the people who are behind our brands and maybe play non-traditional roles within our company to really do consumer facing work that's powerful and impactful.
Thank you. And audience, I don't know if you got this, but all these women know each other. They've been part of these circles for a while. So there's a natural camaraderie here that I'm really enjoying. So you talked about the changes. We're talking about these ecosystems that you're creating, and that is part of the change. One of the things, as I started with that stat, was really kind of a reflective moment for me, is how much of these changes are employee driven and how much of that is coming from leadership, and how have you communicated that to employees? Because if you are going to make these sweeping changes, is it just, throw out a memo and hope that everybody reads it? Or how do you get them to engage with that and feel like they have some ownership in it? I'm going to go around again. So Debbie, let's start with you again.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. So I guess the other flip side of this is the conversation around community, because you've got community within the context of your corporation and your employees. Mm-hmm. There's that subset of community. And then you have the communities where, we live and work. And I think what's interesting to me is, how do you build community or new communities in the context of what happened in the last 18 months, right? Mm-hmm. So that is such a critical piece of the employee communication story, because all of a sudden we have to rely on this screen. This is the relationship we're trying to build, but in so many ways, the screen just became the great equalizer. Yes. For the first time, right? So
we all have the same size boxes.
Exactly. And we all have a voice, and we can share that voice. So for me, that's where the power of the pandemic albeit an unfortunate event, really came to this place where we started these weekly all hands as a company. Everyone came together. Our CEO and founder led them week after week after week. What an incredible moment to get employees together and to discuss things. And then May of that year, George Floyd's murder happened. And we found ourselves in a situation where we got back together again that week, but we were discussing incredibly vulnerable, important topics. And that were, hugely painful for huge elements of our community. And what was really interesting is that we started to take a look at how do the experiences of Black and Brown communities in this country, how are those experiences also felt by the experiences of Black and Brown communities within our company? So speaking of a community within the company. And I think that moment in time, that communication where we started to talk to employees, not just about how are we going to work remotely and how are we going to build together and grow together as a company in the pandemic, but then how are we actually going to get through by educating, training, changing the way we act in a transparent way with our employees, that led to a whole other level of communication and transparency that I think we just weren't expecting. And so to me, the communication of the revival of the town hall, right? Like you go back to like the 1900s and what the town hall used to be, the revival of that town hall in these Zoom rooms, right? Was really the moment of, okay, our leaders are here, they're being vulnerable, they're telling us, they're trying to understand, or in some cases they understand and they're sharing experiences. So how do we actually take that to the next level and invite dialogue in through the ERGs and some of the other ways that you can take part in these actions and solutions. I think we may have lost Lydia for a second. So Kavita, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, that's who I was asking. Yeah.
Sure.
Go for it.
Interrupt. Thank you. So Lydia, to your question, Activating Change Today, or ACT, was created in partnership with Baxter's Black Alliance, or BBA. So it was really employee driven in terms of looking at how do we create a solution that's going to work for all of our different stakeholders and communities. And it started with the top. It's important to our CEO and senior leadership to have these conversations, to make the time to understand unconscious bias and to really reflect on what our teams need internally. And then communicating that across all of our priority areas, whether that's making commitments in supplier diversity or making philanthropic investments in, this outside of Chicago where we are headquartered in the suburbs. It was really looking closely at each of those pillars and saying, what's the right way to approach this? And how do we take a community approach to each of these aspects, from, as a healthcare company, making sure, our healthcare providers are able to and understand how to treat diverse patient populations. And in terms of communications, we made sure that this was an ongoing priority because it's not one and done. And we need to make sure that both our employees and our communities know that. So we host state of the company meetings quarterly. We host updates in our people manager meetings, to really give the opportunity and space to folks to both listen to what we've accomplished and also challenge us to say what else is left to do. We know this is an ongoing program, and those listening circles and soliciting candid anonymous feedback are really important to the continued evolution, not in just launching the program, but helping guide us in where we're going as well.
Yeah, I've heard that other organizations are doing that too, that especially with the level of anonymity, being able to allow people to say things that they might not say in a town hall scenario where they would have to raise their hand and be in front of all of the people. So that's interesting that you're all doing that too. Jen, over to you next.
Sure, and I'll add, because we did very similar tactics in terms of the town halls, the communication, but and I think that education and the engagement piece is critical and important. But I'm going to speak to, just to differentiate myself and offer up different ways, given the attendees here, is we also went to the accountability side. So for the first time in 2020, all senior leaders were evaluated with a D&I goal for the individual bonus. And so I think for us, it was yes, we're hearing everyone. We want to have the conversation. We want to continue to enhance our culture of open communication and what that means. But we're also going to hold ourselves accountable in terms of what it means to be an inclusive company. And so really proud to be able to have that particular performance goal. And I'll fast forward to now, because that was in 2020, but what are we doing now? And in 2021, we announced certain goals around that in terms of what does it mean for our D&I. And I think that what this did was, it's always a push-pull, right? It's especially when it relates to D&I and CSR and engaging employees, and it's a journey, right? It's not it's not a sprint by any chance. Stretch of the means. It really is that marathon. And so by announcing those goals, given what we do around Paradigm for Parity, which many other companies are a part of, for us, it was not just the education, but that the conversations are challenging and difficult, and even just having the dialogue for everyone to be heard is critically important for us as well.
Kim?
I think Debbie touched upon something that shouldn't be overlooked, and that is, what was the power of these small screens and what have they done for creating community? And I would say one thing that has been wonderful for people of color, underrepresented talent, has been the opportunity for people to see you as human and to really come into your home. And I would say the reverse is very true for our leaders. How often before this happened would you have ever gone to the CEO or somebody on the leadership team's home? How often would you have seen their dog or their cat or their children? I would say it's very rare. And so I think that, and in tandem with the fact that we all came back from Memorial Day, and what did you do this weekend? Well, we all saw murder, right? And I think that there's something really humbling and horrible about that, but it also brings people together in a very unexpected way. And I would say, in terms of creating community, one of the things that I'm really proud of from a Kellogg point of view is that we recognize that solutions came from everywhere and could come from everywhere. And, really adopted more of a populist mentality, like, what do you think we should do? And of course, one natural place to turn is the Kellogg, African American Resource Group. What is CARG up to? Like, what do you believe we should do to address the issues that are pertinent in Black and Brown communities? And the CARG leadership team came back and said, you know what? We would like to really address food security in Black and Brown communities. We would like to partner with the World Food Program and Street Art for Mankind and put murals in 7 cities and have a lasting impact, but also invest in culturally relevant organizations. And the solution came from people who were across the business, but also had a real point of view about how Kellogg could show up in a way that was authentic and meaningful. Same is true for our culinary team. It felt like there weren't enough Black and Brown people in culinary. So now we have a fellowship for Black and Brown people. And so I guess I would say, I think the small screen has given us, a big advantage as far as corporate social responsibility, is concerned, because we're able to really crowdsource solutions and allow people to be their authentic selves and show up and really offer solutions that really help to make the business better, but also humanize our companies.
I have to say that one of the panels that I did recently, it was CEO of an organization, and he was obviously in a spare bedroom because there was a bed behind him. And in the chat at this particular session, so many people were commenting on the fact that they loved to see the fact that there was the CEO and there was his spare bed right behind him. So, it's a little thing, but it does really mean a lot. As you've said, it serves to humanize certainly people at the upper echelons of an organization. But one thing that I wanted to remark on, you've all mentioned ERGs, and Kim, you were saying that, especially after George Floyd, leaning on the African American ERGs, it's a fine balance because these people are mostly volunteers and they're doing this work because they really want to and love it and need to amplify those voices. And this is a question again for all of you, how do your organizations empower those ERGs, especially in light of this past year's events when it has been very taxing for so many people? emotionally and certainly in a work context. Kim, I'm gonna start with you, and we'll go back around.
Sure. So 2 answers for that. The first is, I think from an all-employee point of view, we've really invested in mental health and had a lot of courageous conversations about the importance of mental health. And so when I reflect upon the murder of George Floyd, we talked about what it's like to have psychological safety and how we show up as Black and Brown people every day. And we were very intentional in that conversation. We had African American leaders at every level, from every walk of the company, really sit down and talk about what their authentic experience was like. And I think that was something that was really surprising for a lot of our allies. As the pandemic has kind of worn on, we have Pandit Dasa, who comes and does sessions with us often to talk about mental health. And that's a really important thing because, we all show up and do our best, but our best is going to be different depending upon what's going on in your life and where you are in your pandemic journey, quite honestly. And then, you kind of asked the question about what we ask of the business employee resource groups. And because we look at our business employee resource groups as, real contributors to supporting our business, because as you pointed out, Lydia, businesses that really appreciate diversity and inclusion are going to perform better. We have really just stepped back and asked our business employee resource groups, help us unlock growth. And so taking the Hispanic employee group, HOLA, as an example, that group of employees really sat down and said, we would like to introduce a culturally relevant Pop-Tart for Hispanic Heritage Month. And here's what we want this to look like. And here's what we think we can contribute to the business and to one of our most popular brands. And the team launched the Dia de los Muertos Pop-Tarts. They might be on your shelf now, but those Pop-Tarts were created by employees from our BERG. And so those are the kinds of things that I think we probably have bigger appetite for risk now than we might have had when we were in person.
Amazing.
I think also I love everything that Kim said. So I don't want to sort of repeat anything because she said it so well and she said it better than I will. But I want to acknowledge that I think that the moment that the ERGs groups had to step up and to influence, that moment was real and it happened, and it will not, at least in my experience, it has elevated the role of the ERG within the context of the corporation. And with that happening, we now have an amazing group of employees who are experts in that space, but also really help us. They advise, they consult, and they don't need to take the burden of the work entirely by themselves, right?
Yeah,
like
that's what I was curious about.
Absolutely. There's education and training that has to happen. So everyone else is doing the work as well. And that's why I loved when folks were, in that moment talking about do the work. Kavita used the word unconscious bias. Everybody knows what that means now. Everyone knows what a mental shortcut means. Everyone understands microaggression. These are all terms that have come up in corporate America in this last 18 months that are going to stay and live with us because we have work to do. It's progress, not perfection, but there is progress. And so I think to me that has been because of the influence of the ERGs. Those are the leaders. Those are the next leaders of this company. And especially if you're in tech and looking at underrepresented minorities joining tech, we are really looking at a situation where we want to increase Black and Brown leadership in these technology companies. So it's even more important.
Absolutely.
Lydia, can I just say one other thing to contribute to Debbie's point, which is from an inclusion point of view, I think the other wonderful thing that's happened as a result of all of this is that the number of allies has increased in business employee resource groups.
That is good to hear. That is good to hear. I mean, I think that that this is sort of the silver lining to some very terrible things. Debbie, as you were saying, like people understand what these terms mean, we hope, after 18, 19 months of training. We hope that people can take those lessons forward. But I want to hear more about BRGs, ERGs. Kavita.
Sure. Baxter has had BRGs for almost a decade. We have 8 out of our US headquarters, but the unique thing that happened over the past year is both ACT and our BRGs are global. And we've seen that connection between global chapters happen more than ever in this virtual space. Baxter Women Leaders in the US is connecting with our EMEA chapters as well. And I think that is a special opportunity that's come out of this situation as well, in terms of looking at these issues from how they affect our different countries and populations. ACT is a global initiative. And while in the US, we're focused on fighting racial injustice after the murder of George Floyd, we have colleagues in Europe and Asia looking more inherently and intrinsically at what can they do. In EMEA, we launched a new business resource group called the Baxter Multicultural Network to look at employees across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And that was a unique opportunity to say, what are the commonalities between our groups? I think the other thing that I would share is, we've had a grant program with our BRGs for a few years, but this year we increased our commitment to $50,000 for a 2-year grant for each BRG. So they can really look at their communities and say, what are the issues that are important to us as a group? How can we engage with our community, not just from a financial investment standpoint, but from a volunteerism, from a learning exchange, from a skills-based work. So really looking at that, and that allowed them to say, they were so excited. Lydia, you asked about capacity. I think if anything, there's a desire to do more. And I think being able to support that enthusiasm and be able to say, we can do something, we can support you. Each BRG has a month to highlight their different activities, and the cross collaboration between those groups with our Be Well at Baxter and employee wellness activities, along with social impact. It's been great to see. And I think if anything, we need to figure out how can we do more to support those groups and those leaders. We're building leadership opportunities through the engagement, right? We're elevating minority leaders, we're elevating the BRG leadership. And what else can we do to give them the spotlight and the growth opportunities that they deserve?
Absolutely. And I think that by nature, ERGs, BRGs are places where people feel like they belong within an organization where maybe they might be one of a few. And here's the group where, they feel like, totally included and are dealing with many of the same challenges. So that's really great to hear. Last but not least, Jen, tell us what's happening.
Sure. So we kicked off our first employee resource group in 2017. I think for us, the pandemic and the George Floyd murder sort of accelerated the number of employee resource groups that have come to light. So it's almost been 2 to 3 per year since then, because you see sort of a rising tide and people wanting to come collectively together. And I think what it's done is to empower them to have a voice collectively, like you just mentioned, Lydia, that maybe as one, they didn't feel like they had as much of a voice. And I think that while we've had the opportunity to be inclusive with this virtual world, there's some that might have felt like lost, right? Because how can you be seen if you're not physically seen, right? And so I think these employee resource groups have allowed them that opportunity. And I think a nice byproduct of this is because every employee resource group has an executive sponsor from our senior leadership, is that it's allowed employees who we call Team Schein members to also see the vulnerability of the executive sponsors who have come to support our Black legacy professionals, which is our African American group, to Colegas, which is our Latino, Latinx employee resource group. And it's kind of refreshing to see, because you wouldn't have that normally in a meeting or if you're in person, but to have sort of to see the vulnerability. So we do have a Caucasian person who is the executive sponsor for the Black legacy professionals. And why did he choose to do that? And he is very open about his story of why that is. And I do think that by having that vulnerability that we've all experienced, right? So whether you're a working mom who had to deal with multiple kids virtually while they're virtual, I mean, it's added a lot of stress for a lot of women. And so I think that having everybody to come to a common level playing field and be a little bit more open and have that opportunity as well has allowed our workforce to be a little bit closer and has really empowered our employee resource groups.
Yeah. It sounds like it. I'm thinking also in terms of, talking about developing a future generation of leaders. That's sort of a moving target. And some of these goals are not easily translated to KPIs. So let's talk a little bit about non-financial goals, ESG goals. Debbie, why don't you start?
Yeah, I absolutely love the term non-financial goals. And the reason is because, I mean, we talk about this at work a lot. We review our metrics every quarter. It's an incredibly data-driven company. Data is everything here. And so one of the things that's important to me about non-financial goals is this idea that you can't really measure culture. The culture of inclusivity is intangible. It's an intangible metric. But there are ways that you can start talking or thinking or acting upon these metrics. That's really changed, I think, in the last few months. And one of that is, just taking a look at, for example, when we launched our equality statistics, which we do every half year, we looked at the number of Black and Brown leaders, VP+. This is published externally. Everyone can see it.
Mm-hmm.
Our goals are published externally, which is to double the number of Black and Brown leaders in the VP+ category at Salesforce. But then you have to sort of look at how do we make this happen? Let's start thinking about that pipeline. Let's start thinking about those partnerships that can make this happen. And then you start getting into the KPIs and the metrics that feel a little bit more tangible. So for example, you take a look at what's happening from the college to corporate pipeline for HBCUs and our partnership with HBCUs, right? When are we first introducing Salesforce as a skill set to the communities that we want to be leaders within our company, right? Are we starting that in the college classrooms, for example? How are we partnering on a recruiting effort with various HBCU campuses? What do internships look like? And what is that pathway from school bus to boardroom? And the different ways that we can actually help to be part of that story and that journey. And if equity in education is so important, let's start talking about our products like Education Cloud. What is Education Cloud doing to remove bias in the enrollment process for colleges and universities? These are the types of conversations that have really come out of this year. So you're looking at technology now, you're looking at product, you're looking at philanthropy and HBCUs and what we can do there to help with colleges like Morehouse or colleges like Howard that we work with. And then you're also looking at policy. You're a corporation. Corporate advocacy matters. You have a voice on this sort of governmental stage, right? So how exactly are we starting to use that voice to drive some of this change? And so to me, that's where the progress and the KPIs really came out, looking at the non-tangible, the non-financial goals.
Yes. Yeah. Who else wants to connect the dots between the non-financial goals and what you've experienced this year? Kavita.
Yes, I mean, I liked what Debbie said. You can't measure it, but it's not an option to not. Right. Our stakeholders, our investors, our customers and employees are asking the question, what do the numbers say? Because that, in addition to the human stories, those are the facts. And so in terms of Baxter, we've reported demographic data externally for approximately the last decade through our corporate responsibility report. But this year we had the opportunity with the close of our 2015 to 2020 goals to launch our new 2030 commitment. And in that, across 3 key pillars of empowering our patients, protecting our planet, and championing our people and communities, we really looked at that community pillar and said, what are we going to do here? What line are we going to draw in the sand to say this is what we want to achieve? And for the first time, we've set targets for representation of women globally and ethnic minorities in the US. And that was a direct reaction to both the climate that we're in today over the past 18 months and where we're going. And I think to hold ourselves accountable, we're working on that with leadership updates internally, and our CEO is asking the questions, and that's important to us. And I think to Debbie's point, we have to be able to be held accountable, and Jen talked about accountability as well with our groups, in order to see that change and putting it on paper. And we're proud of these goals, and we're going to work to achieve them and make them happen.
Jen, did you want to add?
I agree. I think that the non-financial pieces and the KPIs are critically important, and there's so many standards that are out there for to showcase sort of comparability among industry as well. But I think the one thing I'd say is the goals and targets, I think, are critically important. And for us, we are in the earlier stages of that ESG journey, I'd say, because if you think about it, corporate citizenship is really sort of the umbrella for us, and then CSR and ESG are two sides of that same coin. And
Right.
we're the ESG is the outcome and the impact side of things. And so we're starting to come out with some of our initial goals and targets as it relates to sort of the ES and the G perspective. And so I think the piece that I'd say is there's a lot that we've done, because as a trusted advisor at the intersection of what we call our mosaic of success, right? So we have 5 stakeholders: our investors, our Team Schein members, our suppliers, over 3,500 suppliers, to our 1 million customers in society. We can be a catalyst, and I think that there's a lot more for us in the future in terms of, once we figure out for ourselves our own operations and what it means, how can we then amplify that through our stakeholders to come alongside us. But there's a lot of work that we've done. I particularly would say, given our audience group of the healthcare professionals, is how can we also lift up the underrepresented healthcare professionals, because that's just a big thing to try and tackle. But we all know that a patient is going to want to look to someone who looks like them, because then they'll be a more trusted source of public health information. And so I think, how do we hold ourselves accountable to work in partnership, as Debbie just said, with all of those in the underrepresented healthcare professionals to ensure that there's pipeline coming in? And, is there a particular goal that we as Henry Schein, well, there's things that we can catalyze and work in partnership collectively. And I think that's where we also find it really important to hold ourselves accountable.
Kim?
I love the question, because actually the meeting I had right before this was with an investor. And
there we go. Tell us what happened.
Certainly what we talked about in terms of making sure, that we understood that board diversity is important to them. It's important to us. And it's something that we talk about publicly and often. And I think just making sure that we try to stay ahead of the trend, right? I think that's the responsibility of all of us on this call, is to try to see around corners for our companies. So when I think about, non-financial goals, these are goals that are important to our leaders. I know all of you on the call for sure, us as well. They're important to investors. And what I would say is maybe the most critical audience that people like Debbie and Kavita and Jen and I have to deal with are our children, right? Gen Z is really very vocal about their expectations of us.
Yes, they are. And they're little social justice warriors.
And what I would say is, there's not one meeting that I've ever been in when someone doesn't say, my kids asked me about this, or my niece or my nephew asked me about this. And that the ghost of that Gen Z person sits on our shoulders. And so while we may not, publicly disclose everything that we're doing, it isn't for lack of trying or lack of thinking about it, because that's the expectation we have of ourselves. And certainly the Gen Zs in our lives have of us.
Well, I'm looking at the time and the number of questions that we're getting in, so I'm going to hold off on the rest of mine and turn it over to the audience, because we do have some good ones. And we started this discussion by talking about intersectionality. So I want to start with this question. Are there any techniques you've used to break down the organizational silos of talent acquisition, CSR, DEI, and so on? Does anyone have any best practices to share?
I have something that was really interesting, and in my own experience, I'm not part of employee success, but my own experience as a manager, building a team, hiring people, I was actually assigned not just a ES business partner, employee success business partner for my most recent hire, but I was also assigned an inclusive hiring partner. And I absolutely loved this new initiative. And I realized it was new because I've hired a lot of people in my past, years at Salesforce. And I thought this is such an incredible experience, because what this individual was doing was looking at the needs, my skill set, and actually looking at communities that wouldn't normally see this particular job or think to apply for it. They were combing through the job description and looking for bias, looking for inherent bias within the words that were used. And I was very, very interested to see sort of the pipeline that came through. And what I noticed is that I was able to, and this is in my own personal goals, we publish our personal goals at the beginning of every year. And in my own personal goals, I had goals around inclusive hiring and goals specifically around the number of candidates that I would consider for my open positions, and also the hiring panel diversity. So when I put the panel together to interview the candidate, I wanted to make sure that there were, people who represented communities. And so to me, these three together, this inclusive hiring partner coming together, the hiring panel goals I had, and then the goals around the number of candidates that I would interview before I closed a position, helped to see a difference in the way that my team looks, feels, acts, and the voices that are on my team today. And I think that in my opinion, this is a small little subset of what happens, I think, throughout the entire organization. But it was a really interesting year for trying something new. Jen, popcorning, over to you.
Thanks. I'd say just have the conversation. Everything doesn't have to come from the top down. I feel like everybody thinks like, oh, I can't do anything until something happens or there's processes in place, as just Debbie was just talking about. But I'll use an example where we give grants and have a 3-year strategy around working with people with disabilities. And there's one here on Long Island. And I was like, it'd be great. I've heard that we've gotten interns from them and so on. But I was like, who is the HR person? And I literally just hunted down who could help me and just started calling various HR leaders and trying to get to the right person to say, hey, could you have a conversation with this nonprofit? I know that we've hired interns from them in the past. They'd be a great pipeline for us as potential Team Schein members. And I think that the grassroots conversation of just trying to find someone who can get bought in and to understand that it just takes a little bit of their time that can go a long way, and just get that internal supporter is huge, because it doesn't have to come from your boss. It doesn't have to come from anyone else. Just start having the dialogue and you'll be surprised by how you might be able to find that sort of hidden gem that's there of like, I'm with you. I totally get it, and willing to come along the journey with you.
Here's an interesting one from Tarwana. Wants to know, as shared, there are companies that have aligned their DEI goals to accountability measures which impact bonuses received. How do you commit to an approach like that and maintain an authentic approach to DEI and not just a checkbox? Words of wisdom, anyone?
I'll start. So just because I mentioned the performance
absolutely.
goal as well, so I think that's a fair question. Again, newer for us, we're at a year and a half into this performance goal, and I think for us, it comes down to the culture of your organization and the plan that you have in place to make sure that it is open, transparent, and you're communicating. And it is really hard work, and kudos to our D&I team who put it together, because it's not easy in terms of the education side. But I think more important is, again, that enhancing of culture of open communication. And it's not just a one and done. It is a continuous journey. I think, Kavita, you mentioned it earlier, of you have to keep at it. And I think that's the important piece. So you can't have it so it's just checking off the box, but it brings meaning to people. And how do you continue to communicate that to the senior leadership so that they understand as well? And so I think that's critically important. And we're well on our way in meeting sort of our goals, and so I think time will tell. But you always have to continue to iterate. I think if anything taught us, the pandemic has taught us that you have to remain flexible. You have to
flexibility is key.
You know what I mean? And
we're all twisting ourselves into pretzels.
I'll go next. I paused on answering this immediately because our Deploy for Growth business strategy has kind of 4 components, and the 4th component of it is living our founders' values. And we've had that in place for kind of a long time. And so leaders of people all have an equity, diversity, and inclusion goal that includes, participating in business employee resource groups, mentoring others, and really championing an environment where, equality is the expectation. But then I would say that is the goal for people who aren't leaders of people too, right? The expectation of the company is that you also live that value. And whether you don't lead people, that's not really, isn't part of our goal. And so what I would say is I think it really starts with the culture of the company and really creating an expectation around it. And so I would just offer that at Kellogg, we have that expectation of leaders of people and also those who don't lead people.
Mhm. We have two somewhat related questions. It's talking about, one is asking, in choosing where to have an impact, do you intentionally look for spaces where the government isn't doing enough or can't? And another is asking about finding partners, nonprofit partners. So somewhat related. So let's talk about finding partners and also choosing where to have an impact.
Sure,
And you can all answer. So we'll do a round robin.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I think it's a good question when you're looking for what are the gaps in services or what are the gaps in opportunities. But I think, somewhat to the previous question, it really is going to stem from authenticity and what groups and priorities matter to you as a company. And I think that's the best way to approach it. We can't all solve all the problems out there. We can't all tackle the issue from every angle, but we can look at it from the priorities that matter to us. So as Jen has shared and I've shared, in terms of the priorities that we've developed from workforce, communities, marketplace, and our workplace, it's really looking at how do we have an impact in these areas that matter to us. And the partnerships are really employee driven. I think that also goes back to the authenticity and not just trying to strive to reach a number or target for compensation. But when you have employees across the business from finance, IT, business development coming to the table and saying, these are our different community perspectives. I've worked with XYZ supplier, or I want to work, we now partner with the women and minority led group, the Links Incorporated. We look to our employees to suggest, these are the groups that I know. These are the groups that I've seen have impact. And I think that helps both create authentic partnerships, but also drive results that are built together. Our social investments can't be one-sided. It's not write a check and hand it over. That was long, that was the much older form of philanthropy and social investment. So I think both the community-driven approach internally to those targets and audiences, as well as to identifying partners really works.
Kim?
I'll go next. I'll say in 2017, when our CEO took over, he did a worldwide tour and kind of said, hey, just want to understand, what does this company look like globally? And then we launched our Deploy for Growth business strategy, which has feeding people in need, nurturing with nurturing our planet, nourishing with our foods, and really living our founders' values. And then each of the business leads who were responsible for each of those four pillars created a materiality. And so our partnerships line up against that materiality. And those are foundational principles of which our business is operated on. We talk about it with Wall Street investor meetings. We talk about it internally at employee meetings and, on every team. So I guess I would say that we look for partners who really support those materialities that are both external and public, but also part of our business goals and agenda.
I'm happy to go next. So we have a famous saying from one of our key global leaders of, you can do anything, but you can't do everything. And I think that really speaks to
so true.
this question, right? And coming into a company that has deep-seated relationships and signature programs that are 20 plus years old, it's how do we continue to remain at the cutting edge? And so I'll answer this in the scope of, you need to keep to your core, as Kavita mentioned, and as Kim mentioned, we've done the materiality assessment. We're a healthcare company. We're not going to stray from that. But I do believe that you need to remain innovative and always be at that, just at the edge, right? To make sure that you're continuing to push the needle, because the space of corporate social responsibility, D&I, has moved so far exponentially over the past 20 years that it's kind of formally existed, that it's really exciting. And so I'll use one example of, we've never gone into hunger. No offense, Kellogg, Kim, but it's not core to us. And yes, you can make some correlations around if you don't have a healthy teeth or body, then it's really hard to eat food, right? But I just think that there's a potential there. And as other organizations, whether it's Feeding America, are also seeing the connectivity of nutrition and health, that's where we can come in. So that's where you find your partnerships, right? And it wasn't until recently that Feeding America expanded their strategy and have a very well where that health angle and food banks are working more savvily, if that's even a word, locally with healthcare partners around that. That's where we're going to come in and help support, because that makes sense to us, the intersection of nutrition and health and what that means and a healthy mouth and things like that. So I also push it to the nonprofits. If you're going to be creative and innovative in how you're approaching different companies, that's when we can come in. But we're not going to go off course of what we do. But if it starts coming into our space, that's where we see the opening.
Yeah, and I only want to piggyback. I was clapping silently. I don't know if you saw me. I was just so excited, because I do think that to go back to the title of the session, the issues that we support are now, increasingly intersectional. So let's talk about climate action, right? There's this big conference happening the other side of the world right now, right? So where does climate action actually fall within the context of the causes that we support? Well, guess what? It intersects with every single cause we support. And so all of a sudden, there is no such thing as a company that only supports workforce development and only supports STEM and only supports, education K through 12. Really, it's this notion of what is the lens, the intersectional lens that you're willing to look at these issues through? What are your employees saying? What are your community needs? And how does, in our case, technology actually help? Right? All of these to be able to accelerate solutions and impact in the space. So I love what Jen said about that. Like, there's so many ways to look upon, the causes that companies get behind. And a lot of the times that's changing, and that's a good thing.
Well, in the last couple of minutes that we have here, we've gotten several questions that are specifically targeted to small businesses. And I know that all of your organizations are on the larger side. But are there any recommendations for SMBs, particularly around the Great Resignation affecting DEI goals? One is asking about how do you design or bring on somebody to implement a DEI strategy if you don't have the internal capability? So some recommendations for people without many resources, smaller organizations. Kim.
Two things from me. One is talk to your employees. I think your employees are always happy to be asked where they are, And the second thing is there are a wonderful amount of consultants available to really help you take that data that your employees are going to share with you and make it right for you, no matter what size business you're running.
And that takes us right up to the end, because I have to invite Steve on again. But Debbie, Kavita, Jen, Kim, thank you so much for spending this time with me. It's been a great discussion. I could go on for another hour. I'd love to hear about all of this, and I'm looking forward to see what you all do next. Thank you for being with me. Steve?
Indeed. Thank you, Lydia, and all of our wonderful panelists. I'd say if intentionality was the word of the day, that was a very successful conversation and a really engaging one too. So thanks again to salesforce.org and to all of you in the audience for participating today. If you'd like to join us for more virtual events, you can head to our website, fromday1.co, and check out more of our upcoming webinars. Next Tuesday, November 16th, we'll be talking about supporting employee financial wellness through all stages of life. On Tuesday, November 30th, about social impact reporting roadblocks and how to remove them. And then on Thursday, December 2nd, we'll be talking about supporting employees with family formation while managing costs. So thanks, everyone. Stay well.